Welcome to SilviCast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Brad Hutnick.
And I'm Greg Edge.
We're both silviculturists with the Wisconsin DNR Division of Forestry and your hosts for today's show. NASS, the North American Silvopasture Society? Greg, they're going to never let us in here. We foresters have been criticizing cows in the woods longer than I've been drinking coffee.
Brad, don't worry. Rich told us to meet him here so we can ask him about silvopasture, not cows in the woods. And besides, I've been working on some mindfulness techniques. Just follow me. We must be cautious.
Let me see your identification.
You don't need to see our identification.
We don't need to see their identification.
These are not the silviculturists you're looking for.
These are not the silviculturists we're looking for.
That's really cool. Let me try. Drinks are free for the silviculturists.
Drinks are free for the silviculturists.
We can go about our business.
They can go about their business.
Move along.
Move along.
See? I told you not to worry about it. We're in.
For some reason, I have this sinking feeling we're going to pay for this someday. Regardless, it will be good to get better information on silvopasture. It's one area where I've always questioned how it really fits into silviculture.
And now, where was Rich going to meet us? Well, Brad, you're not the only forester with those questions. That's why today on SilviCast, we are speaking with Rich Straight, Technology Transfer Leader at the U.S. Forest Service's National Agroforestry Center. Rich is going to help us understand what silvopasture is and is not, and what silvicultural techniques look like to develop these systems.
So let's see, last month, maple syrup silviculture. This month, silvopasture. There's a lot to learn. You know what, Greg? You gotta love silviculture.
As you say, Brad, giddy up.
The Family Forest Carbon Program pays landowners to improve the health of their land and increase the long-term value of their property. The program equips landowners with resources and support to implement sustainable practices that help them reach their goals while also improving the health of their forests and our planet. To learn more about how you can access these benefits for your forests, visit familyforestcarbon.org. And now, back to the show. Rich Straight, welcome to SilviCast. Now, before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, I'm really looking forward to this conversation and been listening to your podcast.
Oh, so, and you still came on.
Well, yes. And mostly because of just the easy listening style and like I said, the conversation. So I am originally from north central Iowa. I went to school at Iowa State University, got my forestry degree there. And I wish I had said this originally, and I don't remember who I first heard it from, but I tell folks that I grew up in Iowa, the land of biodiversity. We have corn and soybeans. Sort of like we have country and Western music.
That's right. That.
Yep. So that was where I went to school and had our forestry camp. You remember forestry summer camp that we all used to be required to go to was out in Missoula, Montana.
Mm-hmm.
So that was where I got quite a bit of experience that intense period of time in some of the Western forestry issues. But then actually ended up in working a little bit in urban and community forestry in a town of about 30,000 people for a few years. Because if you remember in the 70s and early 80s coming out of the university with a natural resources degree, there were a lot of people looking for very few jobs available because we just came out of the silent green and coming out of the 60s and early 70s. So urban community forestry, which turned out to be a great experience. And then with the Nebraska Forest Service for about 15 years in central Nebraska, working quite a bit more what we might call conservation trees or conservation forestry and working communities, ranchers and farmers. And then in 2000, moved over to the U.S. Forest Service here at the National Agroforestry Center, which is a partnership with state and private, and now state, private, and tribal forestry and Forest Service research, along with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So it's a three-way partnership here at the center. And that brings us up to 2023.
And I was going to say, we do have, it's not quite a this is your life moment, but I mentioned that we were recording with you, and one of your classmates works with us here in the Wisconsin DNR, Kirsten Held.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So Kirsten said to say hi, and she said, "Oh, Rich is going to be on. That's fantastic."
Yeah. I don't get to talk to Kirsten very often. Maybe meet up at a SAF meeting once in a while. So,
Yep.
Yes, we were in the same class. So that's fantastic. I'll have to make a point of looking her up. So thank you for sharing that.
And we do some work with Miranda Curzon, who's currently the silviculture professor at Iowa State. So
okay,
we've got a connection there with her and with her students. So that's pretty cool.
I think Iowa State is not one of the first names of forestry schools that come to people's minds. On the other hand, because there aren't the deep forests located there in Iowa, the university's program did a great job of helping to place people into jobs, summer jobs, as well as permanent jobs, as well as that moving their forestry summer camp around the country and focusing a lot more on principles of forestry and forest management, and not so much on, like Oregon State maybe have a little more leaning toward this is forestry in Oregon or Pacific Northwest. So it was, I think, a little bit different forestry education than maybe some of the deep or heavy forested states might have happened. But on the other hand, maybe prepared us for being able to critically think and adapt to wherever Iowa State foresters graduates end up.
And I admit I've been really impressed with a lot of the foresters I've met that have gone through Iowa State. So we should have Greg. We need to have a shout out here for Iowa State and forestry in Iowa, I guess, right? So
I think we already did.
Yeah. All right. Well, so I guess today we wanted to really dig in a little bit on stuff that we think about, we hear about, but we just don't know a lot about. And so it's about agroforestry and some of the things associated with that. So maybe, dialing it back down to the very basics. For a forester doesn't know anything about what is agroforestry.
That's a great place to start. So agroforestry, you'll find many different definitions when you go and do your search online. A simple way is to say it's the intentional integration of trees and crops, and in some cases livestock, into a coordinated effort on the same piece of land. And so the idea is that it's maybe not optimizing, but it is definitely an intentional integration. It's not coincidental. It's not just adjacent, but you're playing off the interactions of those plants, of perennial plants and annual plants in your cropping system, or livestock and your forage and trees that we'll be talking about with silvopasture. And another way to maybe think of it is on a gradient. If you're looking at the landscape, we talk about the 5 agroforestry practices like they're very distinct and concrete, when in reality they're probably more of a, like I said, a gradient, where you might have windbreaks are a form of agroforestry, and that's maybe much of the landscape is open agronomic row crop and a few trees that are out there protecting crops or soil and water quality or some wildlife habitat and connecting habitat patches. And similarly, riparian forest buffers in that same agricultural matrix or landscape. And then as you move towards something we call alley cropping, where you'll have rows of high value or crop producing trees that are more closely spaced than you would have a windbreak, and then could have an annual or perennial crop in between those tree rows, and you're playing off that microclimate that's created. So it's transitioned from very open to more tree canopy. And then we talk about silvopasture, which when we have forage and livestock and trees and enough sunlight to grow forage in the understory. And then we move all the way to that other end of the spectrum, that gradient of a forest canopy that has managed to grow some of the species of plants that won't grow in open sunlight. So we're talking herbal medicinals and mushrooms is another one. You can do things like maple syrup in an integrated system. Yeah, so that's agroforestry. I said it was a simple definition, but I kind of got a little winded there. But it's not just a practice.
I like that explanation along that gradient like that. I know Brad and I have had this conversation. We kind of, with you, wanted to focus in maybe a little bit heavily on silvopasturing portion, because for us and a lot of foresters, it's not well understood. And I think back about my career, and we used to have very simple management plans for landowners. And some of those management plans had like one line: protect from fire and grazing. And that was the plan. Like the landowner was supposed to know what else to do with their woods, just automatically. But
Yeah.
just don't do bad stuff, right?
Just don't do
and
bad
so
That's right.
that whole area of silvopasturing has always been a question mark. And so maybe a good place to hone in there is talking about what is silvopasture.
And my background, my training is very similar. In fact, I have somehow it's just deeply burned into my memory. I think it was Paul Ray, who was one of our extension forestry folks at Iowa State, talked to our class. And I see this picture. It's a cartoon picture of a blue cow with a straw hat, with his ears sticking through the straw hat, and like a wheat chaff sticking out of his mouth. And he said, "Cows make lousy foresters." And that was the slogan on the picture. And so I think you're right. I think
I've seen that one.
Yeah. And I can't get it out of my head. It's been how many, 40 years now, and I still remember that picture. And I think that's maybe the reason that sticks with us is because putting livestock in the woods can be done very badly, and it can create all manner of problems of soil compaction and erosion, invasive species, and not very healthy cattle, and definitely root rot and hollowing of high value, black walnut. Heavens, who would do that to a black walnut tree, right? So I think it's important that we acknowledge that this can be done very badly. And when you think of from the south moving the wild hogs that are moving up into our forest lands and continue to creep further north, and the damage that they do in the woodlands. So I think that caution is well placed. The total aversion to any possible use of livestock in a wooded forest tree situation, I think, is maybe not warranted to that full extent, because when we're talking about forestry, right, we're talking about intentional, active management for a specific goal or purpose, and to improve the woodlands, to generate some income, to favor certain species that we want to have on the site. And so when we talk about silvopasture, that is, as mentioned, intentionally integrating and managing the forage resource, the livestock resource, and that tree resource for the good of all of those, and to achieve specific landowner goals and objectives, right? When we're talking private lands, that's where we start first, right? We say, well, what do you want to get from your piece of land? And we've all met with landowners, and they say, well, what would you do? And we say, well, I have different goals and objectives. And they go back to they don't want to do something bad.
Well, I think what I hear you saying, Rich, too, is that silvopasturing is not just wooded pasture. It's this intentional application of livestock into this situation to accomplish specific objectives.
Yeah, that's really a good way to look at it. And the other thing that because we're our audience here is mostly foresters, and we think about cattle in the woods and or wooded pasture or storing cows because I have so many acres and my pasture needs a rest. Where am I going to put my livestock? And whether it's cows or sheep or goats, and we got this wooded area and we're going to just leave them in there for a while. That's not an intentional management to improve or maintain those resources.
Are we talking about, with silvopasturing, planting trees into pasture or establishing grasses and forage in existing forests, or are we talking about both?
And I'd say it's probably a little more diverse than even just both. You can think about whether we're starting with a pasture in which the producer is recognizing that heat stress is an issue, whether it's a dairy or if a cow-calf operation, or with sheep and lambing. Heat stress is an issue, and heat stress is an issue not just in the southern U.S. When I talk to anyone who owns livestock clear into the northern U.S., heat stress is an issue, and so they say, I want to try and address that. So trees into a pasture to eventually create some partial shade, and is one way to do that. And we want to make sure that we're recognizing we're not talking a very few trees that create a very few shady spots. And so we have this congregation of livestock that creates a damage point on the landscape. We're talking about relatively even distributed shade so that the livestock aren't concentrating on one spot. So that's certainly one avenue, moving from a current woodland site. And so many of our woods, particularly in the Midwest and going east, are reclaimed ag land, reclaimed pastures that have grown up in trees. And face it, most of those are going to be our pioneering species. That may not be our most valuable timber species, and we get a lot of brush understory, maybe a lot of invasives. So we can say, let's improve the quality. We'll thin those. We'll leave our preferred trees. Those are better quality. Allow some sunlight to get to the ground. Control some of those nasty shrubs and bushes that we don't want, or maybe have some component, depending if you have goats and sheep. So you can move that direction. Also think about orchards is another area that we see people, orchards and vineyards, is trying to manage that competing vegetation, but also nutrient cycling. And we know that understory plants are forages and grasses with some of that hoof action, and using the livestock to cycle nutrients on the site, but moving them frequently enough that, and that was a point I wanted to make earlier, is we're not leaving cattle in there for a long period of time. We're talking about rotational grazing. So they're going in, and the actual number of days in a year that the cattle might be in a particular silvopasture is probably just that, days, not weeks and months, because another key component of silvopasture is relatively short rotation grazing. So we're really trying to make sure we have good, healthy forage. We're not putting livestock on sites that have wet soils. And maybe not all of the paddocks that a person with livestock, a rancher would have to be silvopastures. In fact, they may want to have some open pastures for different times of year and different livestock needs. So yes, you can come into silvopasture or creating what some of us, I think, in our mind's eye is a savanna, which has an open canopy of trees with a perennial understory of grasses and forbs and maybe a few bush and shrubs.
I think that rotational aspect is really key, because when I think about the old wooded pastures from the areas I've worked, those were basically blocked in as pastures just for permanent placement of livestock, because the rest were row crops. And so there really wasn't, or I didn't see a great deal of rotation in those systems.
And maybe the big take home for me as a forester, but thinking about others too, is that cows in the woods that's not necessarily silvopasture, right? That's maybe just a way of doing business, but that's not necessarily silvopasture. But then there are lots of different elements or types of silvopasture that we might encounter that would have benefits for landowners, that I think it's good for foresters to understand. If we know those benefits, then okay, we understand why people want to do this and what they might be trying to accomplish. So what would be some of those benefits? I mean, you mentioned like heat stress. There are others that we should be thinking about or considering, or just kind of in the back of our mind keeping track of?
Sure. One of those is with that open forest canopy, we'll see forages, how the forage responds to that modified microclimate. So if you think about it on the either end of the growing season for these forages, and frankly, most of them are going to be probably cool season grasses, particularly in Wisconsin, lake states, and Minnesota and northern Iowa, those areas. They're going to be cool season. With that canopy, you have less radiation or heat loss in your ends of your growing season. And so your forage can start growing a little earlier. And in the summer, in the heat of summer, most of those forages don't require full sun. And in fact, when it gets so hot, just like trees, we know when it gets so hot, those trees, the stomata shut down, the trees stop growing, and then what happens? The fine roots start dying, right? Grasses, perennial grasses, are very similar in that way. They don't need full sun. In fact, when it gets too hot and too dry, maybe in the summer, those grasses will slow down in their growth, and their forage quality and the composition of proteins and carbohydrates changes. Well, with that silvopasture, there have been studies done in several places around the U.S. in different climates, but also around the world, that shows that forage quality is actually improved during that hot part of the summer. So we're talking about forage improvement, recognizing that you're probably not going to get as much forage produced in the total year as you would in an open pasture. On the other hand, in those ends of the growing season and in the hot part of the summer, you're going to get increased production. So that makes up some of it, but also improve forage quality. So those are some of the issues that a good pasture manager is going to pay attention to when managing that forest canopy. We mentioned the heat stress. There is also the cold protection, depending on either end of the growing season. Having that partial canopy reduces wind speed. We know wind on wet livestock is about as bad as it gets, so there's that benefit. By incorporating our trees and our grasses, which have different rooting structures and rooting depth, talking about soil health issues of creating a more diverse plant community, diverse roots that are dying off to feed the biome that's in the soil, and having good water infiltration and nutrient cycling. The research is indicating a variety of sites north and south in the U.S. that there's increased soil carbon, and there is also increased carbon storage. So if somebody's interested in buying, selling carbon credits, or just doing what they can, depending on how you fall on the whole climate change issue, there's that issue as well. And then you can also manage silvopastures. We mentioned having a shrub component that maybe it creates the right habitat for a wildlife species in your area that is needing some of that savanna type habitat.
I can see what you're saying, Rich, in terms of how a landowner might want to have some variety in those conditions across their property to kind of get that full spectrum of benefits that you're talking about.
There are also folks who will plant even annual legumes and plants into one pasture so that in going into winter, they get some high quality forage. So I think too often we think it's just perennial grass growing, it's tree canopy, but no, actually livestock can utilize a lot of different things, whether it's an annual forage that's being planted that has quite a diversity into it that creates, improves the soil as well. But I think most of the time silvopastures we're talking about perennial forage and perennial trees, paying attention to the health of the livestock, how long it takes them to graze down the forage so you're not getting it overgrazed, how quickly is the forage responding. Maybe one other benefit for landowners is resilience. As we seem to be, I think data supports, we're seeing more extreme weather variation, whether it's hot and dry or cold and windy, and winter storms that come later into spring. Having some of that microclimate modification can help the producer and the livestock as far as overall health and protect our forage, because we are seeing these greater extremes in weather. So there's a resilience factor.
And you can, and what I've been fascinated by in kind of reading back, preparing for this conversation, is that we talked about recently we had a conversation with Mark Gisselhart talking about maple syrup and sap production, and people were integrating that as a non-timber forest product with some agroforestry, with silvopasture in some places. But it sounds like there are other non-timber forest products that we can integrate. And I'm thinking of here in Wisconsin, we have the Savannah Institute, and I believe Mark Shepard at New Forests. I can't remember the name of the farm, but he's done a lot of work on that, where it's really fascinating to me. We're combining trees, but they're getting lots of other benefits from those trees. So you're mentioning shade, but it sounds like these trees are actually producing things for them too.
Yeah, depending on the species of trees that you're favoring, they could be a fruit or nut producing tree. In fact, there are some silvopasture with poultry where they're growing some, maybe I've heard of some in Minnesota, some hazelnut with corn and poultry, because chickens, we don't think of them this way, but they're more of a forest species in their where they come from. And by having a canopy that's protecting them from aerial predators and shade, they'll eat the hazelnuts. They're eating the insects that are in that multi-species canopy. Similarly, when we think of maybe fruit trees and nut trees for human, harvesting and then either secondary processing or selling farmers market, letting them drop and be another nutrition source for your livestock is another way. One of the original books in the U.S. on this topic was tree crops. And maybe we can put a link to tree crops. It may even be on free press by now, but talked about the amount of food and the nutrition from mulberry and persimmon and from the acorns and from hazelnuts and from chestnuts that in different times of year that can support good livestock health and providing a nutrition spectrum that isn't available of just eating largely a cool season grass dominated diet.
I had to leave it up to Brad to talk about other stuff he can forage from the woods, because he's well known from wanting free food.
I can tell I'm going to have to be racing the cows to get to things now. So.
Yeah, I think like we talk about with livestock, there is always that control factor, correct? Whether we're using electric fence. I'm hearing more about cattle being controlled with basically satellite controlled collars. So there's no fence, and we just keep them in our areas, keep them where we don't want them,
right?
Or as long as we want them in a location. And because we're talking about dynamic systems, permanent fences that break up paddocks may not be the way to go in the silvopasture, because as trees, if we're planted trees into a pasture, as they continue to grow, they create more shade, and that's going to impact the size of paddocks as the forage production varies. Boundary fences, I think most people like a permanent fence for a boundary fence, but for cross fencing, for grazing, boy, there are some really good portable electric fence options out there that are fairly easy to take up and put back down. The solar panel technology for fencing has really improved. Just like any good grazing system, I think access to water is crucial. And it's one of those components that we can use to distribute cattle so they don't get concentrated. And when you think about silvopasture, I'm pretty positive about it, but I also recognize that it's not for every location and for every person.
Well, what would be some of those caveats, or like it might not be applicable? And what are there examples of that you can think of?
Yeah, I think just intuitively we say really steep ground is probably not a good place for cattle to be going up and down. So particularly of soils that maybe are more susceptible to erosion on steep sites. Wet soil, or sites that have a lot of natural seeps and wet areas, because those wet soils are much more prone to soil compaction. So I don't think those would be good locations. We don't have time to get into all the issues around riparian zone management, but limiting access to stream banks for livestock is an important area. So those areas might be we want to avoid. Areas where we know we have a really nice, intact native ecosystem. I don't think we want to put cattle in there. If it's a native woodland ecosystem that's got a good, robust understory of the like early spring ephemerals and the forbs that are growing in there, and it's got good soil structure, probably not an area we want to go into with in converting it to a silvopasture. When I mentioned access to water by livestock, I think access by the producer, the farmer, the rancher, to the site is crucial, because we're talking about rotational grazing. We're talking about maintaining fences. We're talking about checking on the animal health. So have to have easy access. Maybe if a site is not very easily accessible, that's maybe not a good place for us to install a silvopasture. So those are some of the things that come to mind that we want to keep in mind.
I think about both Brad and I have worked in the driftless region for many years. And just what you were mentioning there, Rich, you think about any farm, there's some very steep areas. There's oftentimes seeps, as you had mentioned. There's maybe some sensitive habitats on that property. We have just like this great variation due to this topography. So I could see that that's where some real careful assessment of how that would be laid out would be really important.
And that made me think, Greg, how would you, because oftentimes we can still see evidence of compaction in the woods from that historic grazing. How do you avoid compaction with like silvopasture now?
I think we avoid those sites that we know where the soils are susceptible to compaction. When we've had good spring moisture is when we see most of our susceptibility, or just coming out of winter when there's plenty of moisture and the snow melt. That's one. Also recognizing that we're not leaving the livestock in for long periods of time. The amount of footfalls that are in there, and if we know a site has got, may not susceptible to soil compaction, but are some tree species that are in there that we want that are susceptible to root decay. Maybe we keep them in that paddock a shorter period of time. And then making sure that the livestock move around with the usual grazing management things of moving our salt blocks and mineral blocks and our access to water. I think help keep the livestock so they don't concentrate on just the easy to get to really tasty forage species. So those are probably the key things: is keep the cattle moving and avoid those times when we know that the soil has gotten wet from either recent rains or coming out of winter.
Kind of related to that protection, and I know one thing foresters are focused on oftentimes is timber quality, and the worry is that system is going to impact the timber quality. Is silvopasturing compatible? Maybe some of those techniques you just mentioned are ways to avoid, some of those problems. I guess, is it compatible, and how do we go about doing that the right way to maintain timber quality within a stand?
I think paying attention to the details and what's going on. When we've got good, healthy soil with good perennial vegetation, the forage underneath, that's also going to provide good soil structure for water infiltration, and we're not going to see the vegetation is going to protect from soil erosion, from rain and raindrop erosion by having good, healthy forage. We're not grazing this forage down to within an inch of its life. If you talk to good pasture managers, they're maybe only taking a half, certainly not more than 2/3. So you're still maintaining a good cushion there on top of the soil, and you're going to pay attention to that. The wood quality. And most of the concerns of folks are either on, we can talk a little bit about regeneration, but on damage to young trees. A lot of times livestock rubbing on trees comes from two things. Mm-hmm. Probably boredom is one of them, which probably means they're running out of good stuff to eat, or they have some parasites that are just under the skin and it itches and they're rubbing against. So having good livestock health and controlling those parasites will help minimize the damage. When bulls get in the mood, that's probably not a good time to have bulls in a silvopasture, because they just like to butt heads with just about anything and anyone, right? So, but when it's not breeding season, bulls are about as passive as they get. That's another way to minimize some of that damage. One of the things that we don't do a lot of in a lot of our hardwood management is maybe pruning of our high quality trees to try to increase the amount of clear wood that we're producing on some of our timber trees, if it's a timber silvopasture, because pruning is labor intensive and we don't always see the payoff, or it's because the investment takes so long before you get the return. One of the things that we'll see silvopastures do is do some pruning to try and maintain that anything outside of that 4-inch core diameter is without knots. And so prune the branches up. That also allows us sunlight to come in from the side and get more sunlight down to the ground rather than these wolf, we love to see these old wolf bur oaks, right, out in areas, in cottonwoods in some areas. But if we're pruning those branches up, we're getting more sunlight down and actually potentially creating some more clear wood, high quality wood down the road. And it's tough to do the economic trade-off on that, or you're improving the forage production. So does that offset what part of the labor cost for pruning? But in some of our southern pine silvopasture, we see that done pretty commonly. Unfortunately, not every mill recognizes the high quality wood that's coming off of silvopastures and paying that premium price. A logger would have to be insistent and demonstrating it and showing those logs as they come into the mill to say, hey, these aren't just any old log. On the other thing that I've actually heard from loggers is working in a silvopasture. Now, this was down in Panhandle, Florida, but he said it's easy harvesting. So he said you can get easy in, easy out. And so your input cost on the harvest side is less. And so some of these silvopastures were 3 rows of trees with a wider gap of 100 and some feet between the next set of 3 rows. He said getting in and out to harvest or to thin the trees in a partial cut and then come back later is a lot less expensive. And so we could pay a higher price to the landowner. So there are those aspects as well could be considered.
And now a word from our sponsors.
Today's episode of SilvCast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company. Since 1940, foresters all over North America have relied on Nelson Paint for tree marking solutions. Nelson Paint manufactures paint designed to withstand the harshest weather conditions in the field, and the Nel Spot tree guns have lasted the test of time. Visit nelsonpaint.com to learn more about their products.
Looking for heavy-duty construction and forestry equipment? Check out McCoy Construction and Forestry, your John Deere dealer. With 16 dealerships spanning the Midwest, McCoy offers new or used construction and forestry equipment, rental, parts and service, and product support. Visit McCoyCF.com and follow them on social media to see what McCoy has to offer.
And now back to our show.
So we're talking about the trees. We're talking about that quality, and quality always makes me think that we think of quality in a number of different ways. We think of timber quality, but then maybe ecological quality of these sites. So do the cows are they compatible with native understories and kind of preservation or kind of maintaining diversity of species on sites?
Yeah, I had to go back and listen to your January podcast. Was it January 4th, talking about ecological forestry?
Yeah.
That was a good one. There's a lot to take in that I know wasn't covered. But
yeah.
So thinking about what did our historical savannas look like, and how did they get there?
Yeah.
What were the disturbance factors? Because management's all about disturbance. So they probably had periodic fire, and they probably had large grazing ungulates of some sort. We can substitute in both of those cases some prescribed fire, and cattle can serve in some of that ungulate role. Now, cattle are grazers, and goats tend to be browsers, and sheep tend to be grazers. So we have to think about what do they favor and what are they going to eat. I think one of the things we'll notice as we see older hardwood silvopastures or hardwood savanna silvopastures is maybe that brush component starting to come in. And we may have to look at doing some brush management. Now, how are you going to do that? Are you going to cut it off? Are you going to rotate some goats in there? Are you going to use herbicide, or are you going to use fire? So I think those are some of the tools that we have, right? To depending on what are you trying to restore. Are you trying to restore function? So you have reduced runoff, good water infiltration, good healthy soil. And are you trying to create different structures for wildlife? Because we know some bird species need some understory as well as overstory. Understory for feeding on insects, but overstory for sort of safe nesting. Or do we have some ground nesting birds? We talk to folks who take some of the less desirable trees, lop them over, but just leave them connected to a high stump and tipped over for turkey, or having a brush component that favors quail. So again, thinking about what is it we're trying to restore? Is it cows? Is it goats or sheep? And then are we going to utilize fire somewhere in there, in particular paddocks and rotate through? Are we wanting some regeneration of trees to come of our desired tree species? Pay attention to our mass production. And then maybe that paddock is pulled out of the rotation for a few years to see those seedlings get up high enough that they'll be a little more resistant to any livestock pressure, and make sure we don't leave our livestock in there very long until they have a little more size to them.
Thinking about it in that term of resilience or restoration, that this sounds like it's very compatible with, say, savannas and woodlands, as you mentioned, which I know a lot of people are interested in here in the upper Midwest, especially.
And again, we have to think about what do we mean by restoration? And I think we use some of these big pregnant words, and I think it's important for us to, when we're having these conversations, to see if we're using the same word in the same way. It's really important, because in the end, the owner of the land still has to pay taxes, and they still have to generate income. Now, one piece of ground isn't going to save the whole farm, but if they have an interest of a legacy and want to see that some of these native plant species that grow some of the root crops that are culturally important for some indigenous people, it's probably not orchard grass, right? We have some other forbs that are growing in there, and there are roots and tubers that are used and harvested, and maybe there's some bark that's harvested or some nuts and the maple syrup. We often get asked, is XYZ crop an agroforestry crop? And my answer is, well, it could be. Corn can be grown in an alley cropping system, but a wide open cornfield we wouldn't call agroforestry. And similarly with maple syrup and other things. The maple syrup's a tricky one because you got that tubing, right?
Yeah.
And you got livestock moving around. So
I think that's a really good point, Rich, about just kind of thinking about what we actually mean by restoration. And Brad, you and I have had this conversation a lot of times before.
Many nights.
And I think too, what you're describing, it could be very compatible with that open forest type of system. And it may have a lot of the same structure and function. Rich, you mentioned that as like a fully restored sort of savanna, but it may look a little different, but it may have some of those same structures and functions. I think you just, as you indicate, you got to be careful about what are your objectives specifically, what do you want to accomplish, and design that system based on that.
So thinking about the cows and going back to what they're eating, and this is just maybe for me, but I think about things like this. So do we need grass for this? So this may get to some other questions we'll have about how would you actually go about doing something like this, but is grass a necessary component of silvopasture?
I think the short answer is mostly yes, because if we think about our livestock, that's a component of silvopasture. I was just on a conversation with the forester in the Monongahela just before we started recording, and he made a good point that rangeland doesn't need to have livestock on it. But if we're talking about a silvopasture, we really are talking about a livestock system, a livestock tree forage system. And so what are the forages that the livestock that we're interested in, that we have a market to sell, right? It all comes down, can you sell it, right? So even with our trees, right? And is the market close enough? We probably are talking about grass for the vast majority of these. The poultry systems are a little more diverse, but I still think there's going to be a forage, a grass component for the insects and to protect the soil in those. So now, how much of that has a forb component? I think is important to think about. Just straight up fescue pasture or Kentucky bluegrass pasture is fairly sterile. We hate to admit it, but just like our black walnut plantations can be fairly sterile if we're just managing for a single species. Yeah, I think we're probably talking about some grass component. Also think about that all of our silvopastures don't have to be this big block of trees over forage. We see folks they have a pasture that's up adjacent to a woodland, and the wildlifers don't like grass against, I heard the term today, the wall of tall.
Right.
But what if you go in and feather that out? You right adjacent to that pasture, you remove a lot of that shrub competition, and the forage can move into there, or you can move equipment around depending on your equipment to establish some grass. And as you move closer into the deeper woods, you have more of a brush and a second understory of trees, maybe hawthorns or whatever in that canopy or pawpaw. And then you move into your more close canopy forest. Well, that livestock and have that feathered edge, which can favor quail and other bird species and wildlife species, that the livestock can move in and out of. Hot part of the day, they can move into that feathered edge, and then in the evenings they can move out into that open forage, or use your salt blocks and mineral blocks to help encourage some of that. So it doesn't have to be all or none, open or tree covered. We could have an open pasture with that feathered edge as another configuration. And just like we talked, agroforestry isn't just 5 distinct hard and fast types of configurations. There are these gradients. And we'd like to have prescriptions. Tell me how many trees per acre. Tell me how long to leave the cows in, and how many pounds of seed, pure life seed, to put on for my establishment. And silvopasture is not for somebody who wants a recipe or a textbook prescription for the property. Is somebody who is actively engaged in managing all those resources and paying attention to the dynamics. And then that labor has those payoffs that we talk about of good health for livestock and for forage and soils and wildlife, water quality.
I think that's a good point, Rich, that there's lots of different situations here, but maybe we can kind of come up with a typical example and just try to dig into some of the details about what some of these tools look like. If I'm taking a woods that I have and I want to make this, a well-managed silvopasture, how do I go about that? You said I have to maybe think about establishing forage in the understory of that. So does that involve thinning, for example, of that woods to get to those light levels? Where do I start?
A good start would be to look at, do we have any problem species, forbs, annual plants, shrubs and things. We might think of the invasive species that we need to manage, and will thinning the canopy give them that much more energy to grow? And so we probably want to look at those sites and go in and do some pre-treatment. If you have a lot of tree of heaven, or if you have a lot of amber maple, and you want to maybe get on top of that before you open it up to really have a problem, because you've just provided much more sunlight to those species. So I'd go in and look at that site and see, what do I need to do to control some of the problem species before I do my thinning.
Right.
Then I would probably think about, what are the trees that I want to leave? And what's already there? Is it going to be some firewood that you're going to use? Or do you have some high quality oak? Or do you have some understory pawpaw? Or do you have aspen's an interesting one? So, how much of that? We don't just thin aspen. So maybe you're going to create patches and have the livestock move. What kind of livestock do you have? What are their food requirements? Are they browsers, grazers? With most of that, we're probably going to be thin to a more open canopy, knowing that the trees are going to grow. So we're not thinning every 3 years, right? We'll probably thin it maybe down to, we want to convert to basal area, but it's tricky depending on the size of the tree.
I guess that's one of my questions is like, how, and you make a good point in that it depends on what kind of browsers or grazers you're dealing with. But let's say it's a grazer cattle, like what kind of light levels am I looking at to get the kind of forage that I need?
And you're probably getting down to that 20% or maybe a little less canopy cover. And that basal area, there's some tables out there to try and to work with, and is that down around 40 basal area depending on the species. But you want it fairly open, because the trees that remain are going to really take advantage of that. Their crown is going to be exposed to a lot of sunlight. They're going to respond and start filling that in pretty quickly on the short term. And then you want to be able to have functional pastures for a period of years before another thinning. We do have to be careful that we don't do all that thinning at once. Just issues of wind throw or epicormic branching. We just don't want to take good quality oak and all of a sudden have it all feathered up with sprouts. So it may be that we're going to go in and we'll do at least maybe 2 thinnings to get it down to that very open condition. When I've talked to folks down in, say, Missouri and some of the oak hickory, they're often surprised how much forage does grow up without being seeded. There's a lot of plants that just don't get expressed very well, but they're hanging in there. And so once we get some sunlight in, we'll probably, depending on the size of your paddocks, I've seen people use just hand seeders, do some stirring up of the site, some hand seeders, and of course, when you're doing that for establishing forage, you probably have to use a greater rate of pure life seed than if you have a really nice prepared firm seed bed that's rolled and packed and that sort of thing, which probably we're not going to see because you have to bob in and out. Do you want to leave your trees that are in somewhat of a linear pattern, or are you going to go flow with the landscape if it's got a little slope and rolling hills to it? So but yeah, you're probably going to have to establish some of your forage, and then you have to think about which forage species. Are they going to be native forage species, or are you going to introduce forage species? Maybe you have to do some soil amendment to help improve that forage. If you're putting down lime in some cases, or you're putting down fertilizer, granted, not all that fertilizer is going to go to the grass. we have to think about how much fertilizer, because we know that impacts some of the mycorrhizae in the soil.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't want to just give these big pulses of nitrogen. But if we want to get that forage established in the short term, we probably want to make sure we get it what it needs to grow as well. So we have a good stand of forage.
So we kind of have a stand. So a landowner has the stand, they want to do something with it. So we're kind of thinking about opening that stand and then maybe introducing some forage. Is there any concern? So some of these stands, I can imagine you'd have a lot of slash left behind. Is that a problem?
Brad, there are no problems. There are just opportunities.
Opportunities, yeah.
Yeah, it is something that has to be managed. Sure, you just can't take all that woody biomass and drop it to the ground and leave it lay or leave it stacked up. Just like any of our other forest management, we're doing timber stand improvement. We'll probably have a prescription of where we're going to say it has to be lopped and dropped in within 6 inches of the ground or something like that. Because we're trying to establish forage and we're going to have livestock walking around in there. Yeah, we're going to be needing to maybe chip that up, and it's always amazes me how much chip a few trees produces when you're talking about 4 and 6 inch. Whether it's elm that's invaded or ash or mulberry, we're not going to be able to put it all right back on the ground. It's just going to be too thick. It's amazing how that vertical tree covers on the ground. So yeah, we're going to have to take some of that off of there and to make sure that it breaks down and decomposes and gets some of that nutrient recycled, but not all of it. We're going to have to be able to take some of that out for sure.
Brad, I think about our discussion with John Kabrick, and this was on the lines of savanna restoration, but the stocking charts kind of altered to look at sort of what light levels you need to have first the forbs and then like the cool season or the warm season grasses. And that just kind of all reminds me of this in a little bit of a way.
Yeah, and I think those stocking charts were based on an open grown condition too, which is probably a little more what we're looking at here too. It's interesting.
Yeah, very helpful because most of our stocking charts are closed canopy forest, and so it's rare to find those stocking charts that talk about where on that stocking chart do we want to be and end up. Starting with that in mind is very helpful. And looking at canopy cover, I've used the densitometers to try and do canopy covering with the convex or concave mirrors with the grid lines. I'm not good at it.
Yeah,
I hate to send out somebody else to have to do that as well. So I think we're really talking about those lower end of what we still might call woodland, right? Like using our FIA metrics of 10%. Canopy cover,
right,
to be classified as woodland and then have minimum.
Yeah, like on those stocking charts, it's got the woodland highlighted, sort of the woodland densities, and then your savannas would be kind of fewer trees yet, and so I believe it's kind of well below like the standard B line on the stocking chart. So it would be a better guide. I think everybody groans when they mention the word densitometer.
Right.
Anyone who's ever tried to use one with really success. So having those kind of measures is a lot more useful.
I've had on my plate for years to write a technical note on tree density management for silvopasture. And I had a team of foresters from over in Appalachians, down Southern Pine, and up in the Lake States. Yeah, have you noticed we haven't written that technical note yet? It was really a very robust conversation of how we're going to provide guidelines, whether it's if you're planting 2 or 3 rows of trees that are widely spaced, what's the basal area of that? Because our basal areas are based on, standing in a non-fixed point plot, right? Using a prism. Give me a prism any day over a densitometer. So coming up with those guidelines is not clear because, again, what are the size of the trees that we're leaving if we're thinning or if we're planting? It is one of those things we're paying attention that we're looking at the lower end of canopy cover of that 20% or maybe a little less. And if we're planting trees into pastures, which have a lot fewer ecological questions that we have to answer. You've already got an agronomic site that's been disturbed. It's not an potentially intact native ecosystem.
Yeah.
And then as the trees grow up and your grass isn't as productive, you take some of the trees out. Those are easier decisions than, how much to thin out of our native woods. But having those charts that you talked about and starting like looking at that beeline.
I really appreciate your kind of description, and it's a lot like developing any silvicultural prescription, that just the idea of assessing that woods and what you have, making sure that you don't cause like an invasive situation to be worse, and you take it in that sort of stepwise process. So I think that's really good advice for this and for a lot of situations.
I like it too. I mean, it feels to me like it's stepwise, but it's also, as you mentioned, planned. One maybe a place that I always think of foresters as people of the plan, right? So we have a plan for the next 100 years on a site, and it sounds like that's where it isn't cows in the woods. This is cows with a plan in the woods.
One thing that I should have probably even started with, because we often start with, well, and somebody approaches us about silvopasture, is what's the first thing you do? And I should have backed up and said, the first thing you do is you get a team of people to work with you, because none of us has all the animal husbandry, forage management, forestry, silviculture skills and knowledge to be able to integrate this system. The first thing I would encourage any landowner who's interested in moving toward a savanna or managing a neglected woodlands that has a lot of buckthorn and who knows, garlic mustard, what else in there, is get a team of people together, of a grazing specialist, your forester, maybe an animal, a veterinarian, talk about forest health. What are some species I need to be aware of that could be toxic to my livestock? And it's not surprising to either Greg or Brad that you're probably going to have to talk pretty slowly and convincingly to a forester to say, I want you to help me to put livestock into these woods. In the same way, when you're talking to your grazing specialist, you're going to have to do the same thing, is get them on board and saying, I'm not just trying to have these sacrifice areas with the cattle all congregate around the one tree in the pasture, right? I'm trying to do this integrated system. Help me with your knowledge on grazing. Help me with your knowledge on forestry. Help me on your knowledge on forage establishment and management. And we can come up with, as you just said, Brad, the plan. And that team approach is what is really needed, because most of us are trained in our ologies, right? Our geology and our hydrology. We know what we know.
Yep.
But we probably don't know what we don't know. And we can need to have those conversations if we're talking about ecological sort of restorations or even managing multiple resources. So pulling together a team, I think, is probably, I should have started as the first step.
So if a forester is going to start working with landowners on this subject, are there places that they can go to develop their knowledge base going into this? So are there some resources out there that they can tap into?
And I think we'll end up putting some of these in the, what do they call it? The show notes? Is that the proper term?
Yeah, that would be awesome. Yep.
So I have to say, the National Agroforestry Center, we have some resources on our website. If you go to the homepage, you'll see practices, and then you click on that drop down. There's one of those is silvopasture. There's one. We just completed a synthesis on silvopasture that were surveys done with landowners and you can see what are some of the benefits that landowners who are engaging in silvopasture and why they're doing so, and also on some of the natural resource professionals or the technical assistance providers. What are some of the issues they bring up and the things that they like, so you can get a little background. Our center website has, we call it a webinar library. Mm-hmm. So you go to the website and go to the resources and you drop down, there's a webinar library. And it's not everything that's out there, but we try to go out and glean other people's webinars that are available, and we put them there. And you can sort by state, you can sort by practice. So you could say silvopasture, and it would bring up the webinars and links to those webinars. We don't maintain those other webinars sites, so hopefully we try to keep track and make sure the links are active, but that's another way to do it. There are more and more research papers out there. We have a few of them on our website that our people have been involved with. A good Google Scholar search will find some silvopasture research. There's a website that most of us on federal computers can't get to because our IT people are so protective of our well-being, but it's called silvopasture.ning.
Oh, yeah. I saw that. It looked like a great site.
Yeah, and so it's an amazing site. Lots of dialogue and conversations goes on, resources as well as chat and discussions of people. Hey, I'm having this issue, and somebody else commenting. So there's a place that you can just read through what people are doing or connect with somebody and get some feedback. So those are some places.
And then the one you just mentioned, that looked like it was international too. So you could see how people were putting these into performance in Ireland or Europe or all sorts of different places.
Definitely. Over in the European Union, they a few years back really started pushing issues on carbon and climate change, and actually made it a requirement for land managers. And so we're seeing quite a bit of specifically silvopasture, but other agroforestry practices being implemented, but also researched, so that how much carbon is being sequestered and what are the impacts. Since they're requiring it, they have to have the research to back it up. So you'll see a fair amount of that. Australia has been doing a lot of various forms of silvopasture, and you'll see quite a bit of research coming out of Australia, largely with sheep, not surprising, but it's a good place to learn what are some of the nick points, what are some of the issues before you have problems. The University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry has been involved for a few years working on silvopasture in hardwood in the oak hickory. CINRAM, which University of Minnesota Center for Integrated Natural Resource Management, CINRAM, has been doing some stuff on silvopasture. I think there's a silvopasture association of producers over in Minnesota.
And they even did a little bit on aspen, didn't they?
I think they did, yes. Good point. And we have on our website some technical notes that are a little more of a technical discussion. They're not heavy into numbers, but Sid Brantley, who I believe now is retired, was the NRCS grazing specialist. And he wrote one that I think it's not very long, 4 pages maybe. It's a good discussion on the differences between the cows in the woods, silvopasture, and forest range. And it was particularly when you move further west, there is a lot of forested rangeland, and making the distinction between forested range, which might be considered more of an ecosystem management, versus silvopasture, which is more of an agronomic practice. And so those agroforestry notes can help.
Greg, we'd be remiss too, because we'd have the University of Wisconsin has the Center for Agriculture or Integrated Agricultural Systems, Diane Mayerfeld. So hopefully she's smiling someplace if she hears that we didn't leave her out of this, because that's really important. They've been doing really good work here.
As you said, we'll try to get those onto our show notes.
I'll send them to you.
And that'd be awesome.
Diane and others at the university have been doing a lot of work, not just on silvopasture, but on other agroforestry practices, and really leading the charge, and a lot of connections in that driftless area that you were talking about in Wisconsin.
Well, it's just so often the case. We could talk about this for a lot longer and get into much more detail, but we always have a limited time window. So I just want to say, Rich, I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this subject. And it's something that we often get questions and think about, but we just don't always know sort of what the best answers are. And so I think it's really important for us as foresters to start thinking about this and start working with landowners who are interested in going this direction to try to, provide our portion of the expertise so we can make these things work.
Yep.
It's been a challenging and interesting conversation. And as you said, I don't think any one of us has all the answers, but working together in that community of natural resource professionals and the landowners who have their valuable experience on what works and what doesn't work on their land, together we can make some good, wise management practice choices.
Yeah. Hopefully this furthers the discussion. I think of foresters as like we are problem solvers, right? We're always presented with an issue and we need to solve it somehow. And this is just one more way where we're going to get a question about it. Okay, how are you going to deal with this? How are you going to make this work? So I think this is a fantastic conversation because it helped me a lot. I know that.
Brad, Greg, it's been a pleasure. I was looking forward to this, and it lived up to my expectations.
Boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, when the expectations are really low, it's really
Yeah,
easy.
you beat me to that one, Greg.
Don't undersell yourselves. This is a great podcast.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Rich.
Yeah.
Okay, take care.
Thank you.
You know what, Greg? We could talk about silviculture until the cows come home.
You don't have any cows. You live in town, Brad.
No. I mean, we could talk about silviculture forever.
Then how would you look after your cows?
Yeah, I can see the meds are wearing off. In any event, thanks for listening to today's episode of SilviCast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
And take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team, Susan Barrett, Editor-in-Chief, Logan Badon, our IT Master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.